Hello everyone! Today I wanted to talk about something I personally struggled with a lot when I first started doing art, and something I know a ton of beginner artists struggle with as well. And if you saw the title and thumbnail of the video, you already know that what we are talking about today is line art. When I first started out, my line art always looked really stiff and wobbly. All the looseness and energy from my sketches would just disappear, and by the end, my drawings felt kind of flat and lifeless. However, I am here to bring some good news. There are some really simple ways that we can fix these problems and have our line art looking much better. I've put together a short list of things that you can keep in mind while doing line art that will help your drawings feel more confident and more dynamic. That way, we can keep that loose, flowy feeling of our sketches that we often lose during the line art process. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into it! Number 1. Confidence. This one is probably the technique that'll take the longest to master, and it definitely takes practice, but it'll make a huge difference once you get it going. What we want to keep in mind here is when we're drawing our lines, instead of going for something more like this, where the line is shaky, there's not like a lot of flow, we want to go for something more like this, where it's like one clean, swooping motion. What really helped me get the hang of this is using my whole arm rather than just my wrist. Putting my entire arm into the motion instead of just locking myself into tiny movements really helps to get the hang of doing lines like this. And if you're a digital artist, this is where digital art really shines. If a line doesn't look right on the first go, then you can just undo and try again. The more you practice, the easier it'll become to get confident lines within the first few attempts. And now, moving on to item number 2, line weight. This is a great way to make your drawings feel more balanced and easier to read. A good rule of thumb is to keep the outer lines of your shape or character thicker, and the smaller internal details thinner. This helps the overall shape stand out while keeping the details inside looking organized and also visually pleasing. Here on the screen, I've drawn an example using a square. If you are comparing the two, then the cube on the right looks much cleaner and less confusing, whereas the cube on the left looks a little messy, even though they are the same exact shape. Of course, you can keep in mind that all these rules are flexible, so if there are certain shapes on the inside that you do want to highlight, like for example on a character the eyes or the nose, then you can draw them thicker if you think that it'll help the overall readability of your art. And then this helps us move on to the item number 3 on the list, shading with your line art. This kind of builds off the last tip, but I wanted to give it its own section. This one really depends on how line art heavy you want your drawings to be, so it's not, mandatory. None of these rules really are. But if you do like heavier line art, then this can really elevate your work. So if we're following the rule of line weight, this time we can add thicker lines in places that would naturally be in shadow. For example, under the chin, where folds overlap, or anywhere that light wouldn't hit as strongly. Don't be shy with this. The more you practice, the more natural it'll start to feel. Try to think about where strong shadows would normally appear, and let that influence your line thickness. If you've been watching the screen, I put an example of the freer and angle challenge and the line art I did for that, and I'm highlighting where I've darkened the lines intentionally to give it more depth. And now for our final tip, not every line needs to touch. Sometimes letting your lines remain separate can make your drawings feel lighter and more dynamic. This ties back to the first tip about doing your lines with confidence, trusting that you don't need to over-explain every shape. Our brains are really good at filling in the blanks, so if you have lines like this, your brain will automatically read them as hair, even with gaps. Something to keep in mind with this line work specifically, though, is that depending on the way that you color, it might affect that, when it comes to like filling in line work. If the lines are not touching, then the colors might bleed out, so do keep that in mind. But honestly, I tend to just color my artwork manually, so if I get to get away with lines like these, like this example, then I think it'll, make my line work feel much more loose, like the sketch, because with the sketch, you're not really concentrating on every single line touching the next. So it might be good sometimes to think of your line art in that sort of sense, to keep everything smooth, to keep everything light. And with that pretty much brings us to the end of my 4 tips. Just to summarize, we are thinking of doing our lines with confidence. We are keeping in mind the line weight of our whole art piece. And we are, if we want to, trying to shade with our lines. And finally, we're trying to keep our lines light, smooth, not necessarily touching. Do keep in mind that, of course, all of these tips are just things that have helped me personally, and none of them are, super hard, fast rules. You definitely don't have to use all of them. You can pick and choose what works best for your style and experiment with what feels right to you. And now I am going to put all these tips into practice with a little demo that will kind of show how this will look in action. So I'm using a sketch I made of my persona candle, and feel free to follow along, draw your own thing, or just sit and relax while I put on some lo-fi and we can draw together. Throughout the video, I'll also be highlighting some of the choices that I'm making and how the tips come into play. So if you do like, you can watch more carefully and, pay attention to when the text comes on screen, and then you'll be able to see kind of like my thought process as I do this line art. Now that the line art is done, I wanted to share a little trick that really helps it pop. So we're gonna open our layers menu and then scroll all the way up to linear burn and apply that to our line art layer. Then we will create a layer on top and add a clipping mask on it and fill in our line art layer with like a warm pink reddish color to kind of like give it a bit more life. We will then merge that into our existing layer and then we will duplicate it. Now that we have these two layers, we will go to the layer underneath, touch the magic wand tool and go into Gaussian blur. We will then blur it around 2%, maybe 3% depending on the size of your artwork, and lower the opacity of that layer down to around 80%. Then we will merge the two linear burn layers together, and now with this layer we can also add a clipping mask on top and then color in the line art depending on the colors that you are using in your piece. So normally I would wait to do this until after I've done the colors so I can really see what colors are needed, but like a good rule of thumb is, for example, these blush lines, I would color more of like a red tone to mix in with the skin a little more and have the line art blend in a little better. Then I'll also sometimes color the inside line, so for example in between the fingers I'll also make it more red to help the line art on the outside be darker and again help the shape pop, whilst keeping the line art on the inside lighter and, you know, blending in more with the art piece itself. And that's pretty much it. It's simple, but it really makes your art pop. And here we move on to the finished version. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, I'd love to hear them. And if you'd like any future tutorials, you can also shout off in the comments. And yeah, thank you for watching.